Okay, so we are basically live. So I got a couple minutes and then we'll start. So Mr. Bailey and Dr. Seal, you guys can come on camera. Whew.
And if you all don't mind, I'm going to decross back here. I'm going to turn this camera so that they can see you all, but they won't. Well, I'll let them say it.
Okay. So I see we got you on here twice. Okay, great. We got you. And you guys will introduce and we can all say hi to the folks in the room there too. So that'd be great. And I'll say hi anyway. Just so you do know, we are recording and we'll be able to edit this portion out. And I still have share screen. Great. So I am going to pull up my slides. I have a few just to get us started. And as you know, I can't see you until I drop this down. So anyway, I'll do another 2 minutes and then I'll start this. Can everyone see the screen okay?
Are you sharing something?
Yes.
No.
I can't see it.
You can or cannot?
Cannot.
I can't either.
I can't either.
Well, you know that ain't right because I just showed it a couple minutes ago. How can you see that?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Can you see that?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Lyle, I'm missing Karen K. I was hoping she was in there to come cover the chat and back me up because Darius and Whitney that's on here, they would normally be looking at the chat room. So we're all going to kind of monitor that today.
Gotcha. We got you, Dr. Sheldon.
All right. All right. Well, you know what? I got 2 minutes. And for the folks that are raising their hands, put your questions in the Q&A box and we'll be able to respond. Either the panelists can respond or I will once we get through here.
Thank you for your patience.
Yes, thank you all for your patience. And I got my Google up over here in case I got to look up something right quick on my desktop over here. So if you see me turning, it's the only reason is because I might be pulling something up. So let's see, we got 1 minute. And again, we want to welcome everyone that's here. And hopefully everyone is having a great day. And we are recording this session, which I will be going through some things in a couple minutes, and then we'll let the panel introduce themselves. All right, I have got 1 o'clock. So welcome everyone. It is February the 4th. We are the International African American Museum, and this is our first of a series of 4 for Black History Month programming. So let's get started with a little bit of Charleston trivia. What's the size of a football field and a half? You can put in the Q&A your responses if you'd like. What also is located at Gadsden's Wharf? What has 9 galleries? What's 150,000 square feet? Who do you think has the Center for Family History that will provide educational programs for visitors young and old? Who has membership opportunities? For any of these answers that you're looking for or I'm sharing, you can go to the main page, which is iaamuseum.org/events. And I'm sure some of you can respond to these and answer. So here's a few reminders. The session is being recorded and it's going to be available later. So I'd ask that those of you that are attending, please mute yourself and turn off your videos during the discussion. And if you have questions, again, put them in the Q&A box and also share where you're coming in from. The questions will also be answered after the end of the discussion. And again, we'll keep flowing for as many as we can get to. And again, we thank you for being here. Here's some more information that's coming. Our next session is February the 11th, and that's getting started with Low Country Genealogy. We also have February the 18th, which will be a discussion about the United States Colored Troops. And February 21st at 6:30, Dr. Fuleo, what's in the topic others, spaces of Black spirituality, African Americans, and African religions. So make sure you can tune in and register to attend all of these webinars as well. So now let's welcome our guests. We're in partnership with the Gullah Geechee Heritage Corridor. So Dr. Pernessa Steele, and we're going to have Tanaji Bailey, Lyle Gibson, Darius Brown, and Whitney Day. And I am going to stop sharing my screen so you guys can introduce yourself, tell your affiliation with what group, and what you do. So let's start with Dr. Seal.
Well, hello there. Hello, I am Pernessa Seal, and I am the president founder of the Lincolnville Preservation and Historical Society. And I am here with a group of phenomenal people right here in Lincolnville.
Yeah.
And we are excited to be a part of this webinar with the International African American Museum. And Lincolnville is one of the oldest African American towns in the state of South Carolina. We were founded by Bishop Richard Kane in 1867, incorporated in 1889, and 156 years later, we are still here.
Awesome.
We have a Rosenwald School, sacred cemeteries, sacred churches. We got everything here in Lincolnville. And so if you haven't been to Lincolnville, guess what you need to do? You need to come on up 20 miles from Charleston and check out Lincolnville.
Awesome. Mr. Bailey. Hi. We can't hear you. You're on mute.
You did not hear me. Awesome. Let's see if we can fix that. Can you hear me now?
Gotcha.
All right. That means I have to come over here, which is fine. All right. I'm also here in Lincolnville. My name is Tanaji Bailey. I'm the program coordinator for the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor. Again, we are excited to be here in this community to do the work of resurrecting and remembering our ancestors. And we're just so excited to be able to partner with the International African American Museum to begin doing this work. It's not just this Saturday. Again, we continue every Saturday of the month as an opportunity to begin doing some of that work. So we're excited to begin. Thank you, Shelley.
Welcome. Mr. Lyle Gibson, you're on mute.
Hi, I'm Lyle Gibson, excited to be participating in this program today. I'm history faculty at the Metropolitan Community College in Kansas City, family historian, genealogist, love Freedman Friday. So I'm really just excited about this conversation today.
Great. Glad to have you. Whitney Day.
Yeah, I'm Whitney Day. I'm a research assistant at the Center for Family History at the International African American Museum. I am excited. I have my degrees in history and my interest is slavery and their story. So I'm excited.
Great. Welcome. Darius Brown. You're on mute.
Hey, how's everybody? I'm Darius Brown. I'm from Beaufort, South Carolina. All my family's from the Low Country. I'm a research assistant for the Center of Family History, and I'm excited to be here today.
We are so glad to have all of you today. And what we'll do is I'm going to start the conversation off with some questions and just kind of move around through each of you in that round robin fashion. And the first one is, and this could go to any one of you. What are some common challenges faced when researching African American genealogy? If each of you will share one or two, I'll start with you, Whitney.
Put me on the hot seat first.
Yes. Well, I'm following how you show up from me.
Well, I guess one of the typical ones is that a lot of times they're not on with African American because their first census that the enslaved are going to be on is going to be 1870. So if they were enslaved at all before the Civil War and during it, they're not going to appear on the census. So you have to be a little more creative. I like to put it in doing your researching when you're researching the Civil War time period, and know that you're looking at property records during that time, not like census records and what you typically think from doing research for the closer modern age. So it's just a lot of like reminding yourself when you're researching that have to look differently than what you would be looking for someone in the 1900s.
Excellent point. Dr. Seal.
I think one of the challenges, there are many, of course. One challenge that we have is that we really didn't understand the importance of our history. So much has been lost. You know, so much was lost in the fire when the house burned down, or when someone died. You know, history was just thrown out. We just didn't really understand the value of what we had, and so much has been lost. And I think one of the challenges now is to hurry up and quickly get those stories, those oral histories, and those records from those of us who are still here and who remember, because so much has been lost just because we just didn't understand what we had.
Absolutely. Great points. Lyle.
Yeah, I would add to what Dr. Seal said, the importance of contextualization. So when you have an oral history absent of a lot of primary documents, how do you contextualize that oral history? If you have your oral history plus primary documents, how do you contextualize that information? And it's just important to have a general understanding of not only American history, but the region where you're studying.
Absolutely. Darius, do you have something?
Yes. One of the challenges is record loss. Sometimes courthouses burned down throughout history. For example, during the Civil War, when Sherman was on his march to the sea, he went through the state of Columbia. He went through South Carolina, and he burnt down the county buildings, and all the records for like Colleton and Beaufort County, they were in there. And so there was record loss. And so when you're dealing with African-American research, you would be dealing with deeds and mortgages and bill of sales, and all those type of records was in that courthouse that day. And so you will have record loss, and that could be a challenge when you're trying to go back further and you researching in slavery.
So, and great points. And so the takeaway from all of that is there's going to be challenges, so we're going to accept that fact. And there's different ways that we have challenges. So the next thing, as far as once we find that our ancestor might have been enslaved during a certain time, where would be the first place you would suggest people to go look for more information? And all of you kind of mentioned key points to that. So I'm bringing it back around to there. So, and then Whitney, you can go first. Where would the first place you would go to find a record about an enslaved person?
I've been on, there's a lot of stuff. If you look specifically over the big names of like the genealogy websites like Family Search and Ancestry, they have specific African-American genealogy pages. And one of them that I use quite a bit is on Family Search, their wiki page. They have African-American genealogy, and it has like a list of resources, and then because there's hyperlinks to them, and there's also different states that you can click on. So if you know the specific state, you can click on the state they're in, and then it'll also send you a bunch of different resources for that state and kind of when kind of where you could look for things specifically to the state you're looking for with the counties.
Excellent. So Family Search Wiki, which people can Google also to find that. Dr. Seal, where would you go, or where would you recommend folks go?
I have no idea. I
Perfect.
have no
Thank you. That's the
idea.
perfect answer.
I have no idea. I have, my great grandmother who's buried in the cemetery here in Lincolnville was enslaved on James Island, and several other early settlers. I have no idea. So I'm here to learn as well. I have as you can see, we are all here in Lincolnville. Maybe someone there will know, but I have no idea.
Nope, that is the perfect answer, because we want to make sure, and I'm coming to you, Lyle, to make sure that everybody, regardless if you're brand new to genealogy research or if you're experienced, we want to make sure we're sharing tips and things and hints that can help you with that. So Lyle, I'm going to throw it over to you.
Okay, one of the things, and this is a huge if you have a tiny shred of oral history, that's part of your foundation, even if it's just a name, a geographic location associated with that particular name. That's kind of the foundation if you have it. And then next, as Dr. Shelley always tells us, start creating a timeline with what you have in front of you. And then you slowly start to work your way back. One of the things that I would suggest, if you have that name of an ancestor, if you have that geographic location, just start with the Freedmen Bureau records. That's one place. Also, research the county or the parish where your ancestor was, to learn as much as you can about the influential people of that county. Some of them may have been slaveholders. And so that way you can start learning the names of the slaveholders, even though you haven't made that firm connection yet. You start to, educate yourself about that region.
And that's when we come into knowing your community and making sure people go local. And I'm going to make one point before I turn it over to Darius. And the fact that, yes, there's a lot of online resources, and Whitney named a couple. You got ancestry.com, you've got familysearch.org. You also have a site that's still up with a lot of information called afrogenius.com. They also have a Facebook page. So one of the things is to think about, where are all these online resources obtaining their information? So I'm coming back to what Lyle said. Everybody that has a database online got that information from the local level. So you start off, like he said, with what you know, build a timeline, but start in the location where your people were at. And it doesn't matter if you know them in 1900 and you're trying to get back to, say, 1880, start with where you know they're at and learn that community and exhaust the local records first. So Darius, where would you send folks, or where do you go first?
Well, I would like to piggyback off what Lyle said. Take your oral history serious. The elders, they knew quite a lot. And also, like he said about a timeline, if you can pretty much make a timeline and you know where your ancestors were before 1870, make sure you know the local history of the county that your family is from, and get acquainted with all of the slaveholding families that was in the area. Now, you do have the 1860 slave schedule that has the names of the slave owners and stuff like that, but get acquainted with your local, your county history and stuff like that, and so that you can make, educated decisions, in the process.
So I hope everyone's taking notes. And Dr. Seal,
Yes,
we're lining up some things for you here.
I'm taking notes. I am taking notes.
Okay, so now I'm going to put this out openly for any of the panelists, and again, this will acquaint the audience to what type of records do you find that an enslaved person would be on. And Lyle mentioned, and I'm going to say an enslaved person or a formerly enslaved person, because he mentioned a record set in which he can expound on that. So it's open, whoever wants to go first on this one. What type of records would you see an enslaved person on, or someone that was formerly enslaved?
If I may, and let me mention my documented South Carolina roots, York County, South Carolina. Yes. But you can find information on your enslaved ancestors in a host of documents. I found one set of documents, actually a Bible record, that was where the owner, and he was also a judge out of Georgia, he documented not only the births of his family, he documented the births of over 50 of his enslaved human beings. And it gives you the birth year. And the interesting thing, you can take a document such as that, if you find it, and then start comparing it to other primary documents like the slave schedule. And right now I'm going to be using the historic term, so I don't mean to make anyone feel uncomfortable, but slave schedule is what it was called for 1850, slave schedule for 1860. So when you do have that slave owner's name and you're following them in the traditional genealogical sense, you got to research them as well. Then you start working your way either, from that older document up to the 1870s, 1880s, or working your way back to that particular document. And there are a host of things that you can find. And don't discount doing what I call these random, and not random in a negative way, but random research on newspaper.com for runaway slaves, auctions that may have happened. So there are a host of things that are available to us now because of technology, where we could start looking at the documents. But once again, to kind of recap, the possibility of a Bible record or personal records held by that former slave owner, and then newspapers of that particular time period.
And to add to that, before I turn it over to Darius, is remember, and Whitney called it out, that enslaved people were property. So you have to find the property records of the potential slaveholder. That can appear in several databases, but it's also at the local courthouse possibly. And so we'll get into this a little bit more, but remember, property records is number 1. Bible record is number 2. You've got the slave schedules, number 3. And even prior to those 2 slave schedules, you might not get the name of your ancestor, but you can start compiling to find more about the slaveholder. Okay. In other words, did he die and leave the estate to his wife and his sons? You've got to get his will, because you know what? All estates have to be settled. Property was divvied out, as in equipment, animals, and human beings, as in enslaved or owned by. Darius, go ahead.
Well, this is the kind of research I do every day. So
yes.
You said one of them, wills. Yes. If you know the name of the slave owner, you need to make sure, you need to know the slave owning family genealogy just as much that you know your personal family history. You can find enslaved people in wills. I have a side of my family that was owned by the Pinckney family out of Charleston, and my entire family was listed in one of the wills of his name was Charles Coltsworth Pinckney. His daughter and his daughter will. My entire family is in there, several generations. You can also find enslaved people in mortgages. They use enslaved people as collateral for loans and stuff like that. You can find them named in there. And like I think someone mentioned newspapers. Newspapers. People ran away all the time, and they would put them in there, and they would say, you know, I will give you, you know, basically a reward if you return this person back to me. And so it's a many stuff that you can find enslaved people in, and like the main one is property records too. You know, deed records when they were recording lands transactions and plantations. Sometimes enslaved people were recorded in there too. And so property records are a big deal too, for finding enslaved people.
Great point. And I will add another thing for educational purposes. Realize that property could be rented out, could be mortgaged, could be used as collateral, and then they could be sold. So again, each one of those could be another record that you could find. Whitney, did you want to add anything? If not, I'll move on to the next one. Any records that you've come across that you'd like to share?
Well, like I can just kind of add on. I know one is I've done a lot of research in Williamsburg, Virginia, and looking at church records, especially like of the local churches in the town, because I know with Bruton Parish in Williamsburg, they have their church record and they have a list, a bunch of baptisms on there. And there's even like the enslaved, like them baptizing their enslaved. So you have their records on there or being born. There's also education records, I also think is something that's also important to look at, especially with, if you know, like the city and county they were in. If you look, there's a lot of times that we've come to know more in the past recent years of schooling being done, of schools, and you can find records of the actual like kids that attended the school, and half the time they also have their owner is on the list too, of like who owned them and their age is also a good thing. And then I also think personal like letters written from people of like your either like your relative or the owner writing letters to their friends or whatever, or like business through letters is also a thing to track and see kind of like who they're talking to and like who they interact with in their daily life.
Great points. So I do want to highlight a couple things that you guys mentioned. Number one was slave schedules. There were slave schedules, which is like a population schedule that we know of now. Regular census population schedules are federal, so it's a federal document. So during 1850 and 1860, what you have there is a census that was collected, and it will have the slaveholder's name. And then the African Americans that are enslaved are only identified by their age, their gender, and their color. There's no names. There's only about 7 different places throughout the southern United States where there's actually the names of the enslaved. And I'm gonna say this. It was somebody in South Carolina that voted and said they don't need the names of the enslaved, right, on the slave census. And it's a population census. So you can see a slaveholder's name, basically like the head of a household, and then female, age 40, male, 30, and so forth. Children, no names. Only 7 places throughout the United States. So that's what a slave schedule is. Your regular population census starts from 1790, and right now we're up to 1950. You can access population census online, Ancestry and Family Search. Ancestry is a paid site, but Family Search is a free site. Okay, so let's move on. So we're clear about census. Lyle mentioned another record collection, and this is to hit, there's this theory about a brick wall about 1870 and about a record collection that you could find your ancestors who could have been enslaved or free prior to 1870. So Lyle, I'm going to let you talk about the 1870 so far myth and then the Freedmen Bureau records, if you would.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Shelley. So 1870 is, as far as the census record, where we see those who were formerly enslaved listed as free. Now, let me add this tiny little piece. On some enslaved schedules from 1860, for whatever reason, it didn't happen nationwide or it didn't happen throughout the South, only in certain locations. For whatever reason, the enumerator did put the name of the enslaved, but that's a very rare.
We got 7 so far we found.
Rare instance.
Mhm.
Now, once again, as we've already mentioned, you have to look at your geographic location. And so there are a couple of things that's happening. Number one, historically, 1870 is right in the middle of the Reconstruction period. And so there are going to be Reconstruction documents, one of which we call the Freedmen Bureau, established in March of 1865, that's going to have a collection of documents that deal with a host of things. So you'll find information relative to the military, whether it's letters that they sent, letters received, rations paid. You now have work contracts that are being established between landowners and the newly freed slaves, marriages, U.S. colored troops. Sometimes their documents are going to be within the context of those Freedmen Bureau records. You're going to have a host of records within that particular time period. But another set of records that's equally important in my view for African-American men, because of the Reconstruction Act, the second one of March, in the latter part of March of 1867, when the military was put in charge of voter registration. And so you're going to have all of these men, white and Black now, who are going to be on those 1867 voter registrations. Some of them may have spilled over into 1868. You will find basically the name, the precinct, and then whether or not they were white or colored or white or Black. So it's a small document if you do find your ancestor, but once again, it goes back to how do you contextualize that document with the 1870 census. The state of Alabama has an 1866 state census. So check your state to see if there was a state enumeration during the Reconstruction period. And for the state of Alabama, they have the white enumeration for 1866 and the colored enumeration for 1866. Also, if you look in some Freedmen Bureau records that list the county, list the state, sometimes, not all, you can go to that county courthouse if the records are still available. You may find additional information that's not necessarily been recorded with the Freedmen Bureau. So between 1865 to 1877, there are going to be a host of documents, the voter registration rolls, the Freedmen Bureau rolls, as well as your county records that may exist. And then the other branch of that, don't forget about your Freedmen's Trust or your Freedmen's Bank records, because sometimes those records are just as valuable as the other records, depending on how much biographical information is actually given. In some cases, the former owner, the parents, siblings, it just depends on what information you may find.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And I will comment, you mentioned the employment records. So and I'm saying this, for Lincolnville and everyone else, but think about this. When the Civil War ended, the people that were enslaved are now free. They go to these field offices, which is the Freedmen Bureau, that could be in their area. There is a website called Mapping the Freedmen's Bureau Records. And we can put that, someone can type that in the Q&A for me. That's a good site to go locate. And if not, we can do some follow-up. But what I wanted to point out is after the war ended, people were going for assistance. This is where you're going to see names. If you've got a name of your ancestor, you want to search through, and it's a total of 3.5 million records with names on them of free, formerly enslaved, and whites. The proper name, so if someone wants to Google, is the Bureau of Refugees, that's whites, freedmen, and abandoned lands. Freedmen are the ones that were formerly enslaved. It's also called Record Group 105. So if there's a question, where do I find these records? You find them on Family Search, you find them on National Archives, and you find them on Ancestry. You can put names and find them. Or you go to the mapping site that we talked about, and you go to the county if there's a field office and find out those records, like Lyle said, employment records. Former slaveholders needed that labor to keep that plantation going or to keep their family's livelihood going. So they would turn around and hire their formerly enslaved folks because now they have to pay them. And the Freedmen's Bureau helped negotiate these labor contracts or these employment contracts. So I'm going to shift a little bit more. So there's more for that. And maybe it's an opportunity. One of these sessions that we have is just on the Freedmen's Bureau. So I'm going to throw a question out to you. Was there slavery in the North? And give me a yes or no and anything else you want to say. And I say this for a reason, because we want you to know where records could be. Don't just look through the South. Darius?
Yes. That there was slavery in the North.
Okay. Any comment, Whitney?
Not just like this, yeah, there was, and this,
Okay.
You're just gonna find records where you don't think you're gonna end up finding records, you'll be surprised by it.
And that's the point of that question. Lyle?
And be mindful, because each colony moving into statehood had different provisions for ending or abolishing slavery. And so some had kind of a perpetual type of thing where you may have had children well into their 20s, 30s, or even 40s who were still enslaved. So you have to look at the individual records for that particular colony, eventually state.
So, and Dr. Seal, you also acknowledged it. So there's another challenge that doing this type of research we run into all the time. And that's the enslaved person with a first name only. So one of the things we want to share with you is that not all enslaved people took the slaveholder's name. Don't even assume it. Don't expect it. You got to go with what you're going to get when you get there. And in my personal research, I've been looking for a Bob for 3 months. Don't know what name he's going to show up either in the Freedmen's Bureau or in the 1870. But that is a huge challenge. So I'm looking for the panelists here to respond. How would you research that challenge of a first name only of a person of African-American descent? What is a tip or a strategy you could share to help someone if they got a first name only? And it's open out. Whitney, I'll go to you first.
I think really is to kind of go, so you have a name and go to kind of figure out if you know anything else, maybe like about kind of what age he would have been if you did go from like other records and things to kind of figure out, go, maybe he's about this age kind of a thing, and where he is to kind of look at like the county and like the local records to kind of figure out maybe like other people kind of that were kind of like him, like around that same age, kind of what they were doing to kind of get an idea, kind of like what his life was a little bit, to then kind of go from there. And I know it's like, if you have like a little bit of pieces and more for information, at least with me, I kind of like when I'm looking at stuff, I get a gut feeling sometimes. I'm just like, okay, this could maybe be it. And other things I'm like, okay, really don't think this is it. Just from like, kind of like going with your gut. You just kind of, at least personally, I just kind of get a feeling being like, this could maybe be something.
Darius?
What I do when I'm researching like bill of sales or property records, I find my enslaved ancestors in those records. I look for other family members because I look at it like probability. What's the probability that my ancestor name was, I don't know, Isaiah, and his parents was named Cuffy and Diana. And then I look in a mortgage record that the slave owner has, and you see Cuffy, Diana, Isaiah, and the name of Isaiah other siblings in there. That the probability is really low that that's not them. And so it's most likely them in this record. And so that's what I do with a lot of the records that I find. If I know that this person's parents was alive and they had other siblings, and I see, and a lot of times in records, bill of sales, estate records, sometimes it's in family units. And so you would get the father, mother, children, not all, or sometimes it will be reversed, mother, father, and then the children. And so you can vet it by looking for other family members, not just your ancestor, and that will also help you. And
Which brings you back to the community and knowing that area. You also want to know the slaveholders in the family, in the county. And you can look for online resources for that. Like South Carolina, you can Google South Carolina plantations, slave owners, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, whatever. So that's a simple way of doing it. And then you can always go to the census that were mentioned, 1860 slave schedule, because it's going to identify them by name.
By
the
name.
1850 census. Yes. Did you want to add something to that?
And what I also was going to say, I was going to say you can compare like the 1870 census, the first census that, they might appear on there on the census, and you can compare that family grouping to records. Sometimes in the state records, they get real detailed. They say such and such and his wife and their children, sometimes it's not always a first name and then some numbers next to it, how much they, their value and all that. But some of the records are detailed. They tell you this is this person, this is his wife, and then this is their children. And if the grandmother's still alive, his mother. And so things like that also occurred.
Yes. Lyle, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I was just going to say too, when you're going in cold and you only have, let's say, that first name, as Darius and Whitney have already mentioned, start fanning out, especially within the neighborhood. The traditional way we used to do census research, we had a microfilm and we had to crank page by page. And so now we have technology, but you still need to do what we call that scanning before you find your ancestors. So go about 3 or 4 pages prior to that, 3 or 4 pages after that. Naming patterns are also very important, especially if your family members had unusual names. Sometimes those unusual names will be passed on generation to generation. And so it's very important to look at naming patterns. Also look at if an ancestor or someone you're researching has a surname for a given name. That's very important because it may be a clue with regards to more information about your family.
Absolutely. So, and again, we're still talking about the challenges. And technology has changed that. Some of us that have done this for several years, we know the opportunity of using the databases are really good. Can you, and I'm saying this as a question, can you actually trace your ancestor who was enslaved and find what ship they came on or came into when they came into this country?
Things like that are a bit anomalous, anomaly. A lot of people, for a lot of our ancestors, like speaking for myself,
Mhm.
a lot of my ancestors were probably brought here in like the mid to the late 1700s. And for like most African Americans, if you can't get past the 1870 brick wall, then you might not never know where your ancestor came from. But we have stuff like, DNA testing. And a lot of people get caught up on the percentages, this says I'm Nigerian and this and that. But many times people will still have relatives from Africa on their DNA matches. So if your mom took the DNA test and you see her on there, okay, yeah, that's my mom. And then if you scroll all the way to the bottom and you see somebody named, I don't know, Musa Diallo, and he's from Senegal. Well, you and him have some type of common ancestor, which is why you and him still share DNA. And so I have over 30 cousins that's in Africa. And so I'm pretty sure I know that my ancestor was taken from that family. And that's why me and those group of Africans, we still share DNA. But we do have records for like the slave trade and stuff like that. Now, on one side of my family, I do know where the slave owner was purchasing Africans from because I found them in the slave traders account book, and he was buying people from Sierra Leone and the Gambia River. And then I have cousins from there. And so it makes sense that on my DNA test, I have cousins in Sierra Leone and Senegal and Gambia, where he was buying people from there. But stuff like that is kind of hit and miss, And so that's one of the unfortunate things for African Americans when it comes to like, finding where your ancestor came from in Africa. Because you're not gonna now some people were still alive on the census, the 1880 census or the 1870 census. If they were born in Africa, then they will put that they were born in Africa. But the 1880 census is the first one that asks for your parents' birthplace. And I've seen people who were still alive, they were born in South Carolina, but it says that one of their parents was born in Africa or both of their parents were born in Africa.
In which you can also do that as a search. So you can go to your county that you're looking, right? And I'm saying ancestry or family search, and put birthplace or the location and put Africa and just see what comes up for that county. And I think we've done that. Lyle, did you have something you wanted to add or? Okay, so the other thing, so, and Dr. Seal, if you got a question, raise your hand, hoping we're covering enough stuff. So the census, again, is a federal document. There is a Census Bureau or a census.gov, and you can go get all of the census and the enumerator training guide, and you can look at the questions that are asked. So you want to look at that questionnaire, download that so you understand and learn when you're looking at, say, the 1870 census. What are these questions? What are they pertaining to? Is because there's a time in the census, and I can't think of it right off the top of my head, that all the people under the person, it tells you that they're supposed to say how they relate to that head of the household. Because other than that, it's a guess. Just because there's a man and a woman doesn't mean that's husband and wife or parents of everyone else that's in the household, because some census don't identify the relationship. So you want to go to the census, and you can download blank census forms for free off of Google. Family Search has them, Ancestry has them, Family Tree Magazine also has them. So learn what those columns are that they're asking, just like the census we just took for us in this day. You had questions to answer. Those could be leads to finding more information, because you get how many years you've been married. You might get an approximate age. Where the parents, like Darius mentioned, where were your parents born? And you're tracking and saying, I'm not going to say everything is correct that's on a census, because those early years, you don't know who gave the information. It could have been the kid next door. So you want to validate and find additional information to help support whatever you're filling out on that timeline or your family tree and things like that. So I think we got a couple, just time for another question. What?
Hey, Shelley.
Yes, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to add real quick. When you're researching the census records, especially 1870 to 1900, if you find a name you don't recognize, that's when you pick up the phone, you start calling the elders. Who was this? That happened to me, 1870. My third great grandfather found everybody in the house. Then there was a guy named Doc Ellis. So I had to pick up the phone, call one of his granddaughters. Who was Doc? Oh, that was Grandpa's brother. Never heard of that. So
Excellent.
You have to research everything you see on that census.
And that goes back to the tip of saying what you know, oral history. And oral history should serve, number one, it's the stories of our families, but it should serve as a ground or a foundation to kick you off into go find more information. So as the elders or aunties or whoever it is that's sharing information, then you try to go find supportive stuff to support that, or that you might find that it's something else. There's times in my own family where I say there's two versions of this story, because what was remembered, and then we got documentation. So then you want to bring them together, and be able to go from there. So we've talked about several challenges and several things to help combat those challenges. So now for each of you, what would be the one takeaway that you would want someone to do once they start researching African American ancestry, something that we have not talked about? And I'm going to set aside, don't forget vital records. And one of y'all can expound on vital records and the benefit of finding vital records, as in birth, death, marriage, and we already talked about wills. So I'm going to come to you, Whitney. What would be the one thing you would like everyone to know and to do to help combat a challenge that you faced researching African American ancestry?
I think one is the vital records, but I think back to the census conversation is a lot of times they also say if the house was owned or rented. So if it's rented, you can go look at the county records and see who were they renting this house from, and you can go and learn that. And I think one thing especially is this, it's not just about the person or your direct line, it's growing out the branches and doing the cousins, the relatives, and even when you get to points, the people they were interacting with says a lot, and you can maybe find out more, and that can help with stories, because maybe there's a story be this was this person's best friend, and you wouldn't know that unless you were researching who their neighbor was or whatnot, and kind of the help and things of that.
And we call that the FAN principle by Elizabeth Shown Mill. Who's the friends, friends, associates, and neighbors. So you want to know, and also you're going to have to tap in to research them as well. So Darius, next one to you.
I was going to actually talk about the FAN method.
Go ahead.
I think a lot of people, when they think of doing genealogy, they just think of their direct ancestors, but you also have to have the siblings of your ancestors. And so a lot of people ask me, well, how do you get 8,000 people in your tree? And I say, well, that's because I add my direct ancestors and their siblings. And
Mhm.
Everybody had 8 or 9 other siblings and on each generation, and so it adds up. But yeah, make sure you research them as well, because they could be the reason why you get to the next generation. Your direct ancestors may not have may not be documented in a lot of records, but maybe your direct ancestor had a sister or a brother, and they have a death certificate and they list the parents' names. Now you back to the next generation because you looked at their siblings. But that's one tip that I will give.
Lyle,
I think I can show while I say this. Just bring this up real quick.
and while you're sharing that, someone asked a question. It's mapping the Freedmen's with an S, bureau.com is that site for the Freedmen's Bureau. So go ahead, Lyle. Thank you.
Okay, so we talked about, names, naming patterns, all these records, and then Dr. Shelley mentioned a death certificate. Don't get wed to a particular surname, a particular given name, because sometimes things could change. So real briefly, my second great grandfather, John Gilmore, is who I knew him by, but the oral history said at one time he went by the surname White. But just kind of going through this real briefly. So 1866 state schedule, he's enumerated as John White. 1867 voter registration, John Gilmore. So just within a year, 2 different surnames, same person. 1870, 1880, Dale County, Alabama, John White and family, John White and family. But then when we get to the 1900 schedule, John Gilmore for 1910. However, if I look at the 1920 poorhouse, he's going to be John White. And if I look at the death certificate, sadly, he burned to death in a fire. If I look at the death certificate, it's John White. So if I didn't have the oral history that says he went by both, I would be missing out on key information. So the earlier records, John White, John Gilmore, but the last 2 records are John White. So it's important to contextualize not only your oral history, but now when you start to include those vital records, and I'm so fortunate, I have this vital record of one of my formerly enslaved ancestors. You really got to contextualize all of that information. And sometimes you have to step away from your research because you're going to be getting so much information. How do you process all of that? But vital records play a very important part in our research.
And I'm going to mention that there's the Midwest African American Genealogy Institute. That's the only institute in the United States that focuses specifically on African ancestry. And one of the courses there they teach is methods and strategies. So different teachers, instructors around the country, and they always talk about every record creates a record. So using that example, he had the death certificate. So this is one of these takeaways. Put your thinking cap on and say, I've got this death record. What other records get created because I have this record? And I'm just using a death record. You can do any record. So think about that. And I want the audience think about that in Lincolnville too. So you got a death certificate or a death record. What happens and what other records get created because somebody passed? That is your lead to more information, right? And more, because when you get a death certificate, doesn't mean you're done. You're just getting started. If the death certificate is filled out correctly, and most of them are not, and you've got to be creative enough to ask questions, they will have the name of the deceased. It will have the parents of the deceased. It should have the wife of the deceased. And don't forget who's the informant that gave the information. And you might have burial information. And look for people's obituaries, because right there you're going to probably get their genealogy. You might get names, who's left behind, and there's your strategy to go research them. So thinking about the vital records, that's one example that will help, because you're going to hit these challenges. First name only. You're going to get, not being recorded during slave era, property, and so forth. So I'm going to look at Dr. Seal, and I'm going to say, what question do you have? And then we'll go to the audience questions.
Well, I have a statement. I want to say thank you. This has been a wealth of information, and a few things come up, not in terms of a question, but in terms of some of the challenges that we have mentally. When we do this work, sometimes we don't want to deal with our ancestors who were enslaved, because we have been so brainwashed that we just don't want to deal with the slavery part of things. And we have to get past that, because we owe them such a debt, because they survived. They survived, and we owe them the honor and the pride they deserve to move and find out who they were, because we are them. We are their legacy. So for those of us who struggle with, I just don't want to deal with the slavery part, we really need to move past that and really honor those who survived and those who didn't survive, because we are them. Also, it is important because their DNA is our DNA, and I'm in public health. And with new technology, the chromosome has been, now we know all of these marks on the chromosome and health. The health aspect of our ancestry is so very vital to us today. It is important that we do this work for the blood that runs through us. And lastly, I've been blessed to have been all over the continent. And if anybody wants to go to Africa, this is a good time to get going, because it's nothing like going into a village and seeing everybody that looks like you. They act like you, they behave like you, and you may go to Kenya and you don't see nobody. But then you go to Nigeria and everybody's talking to you in Igbo, because you look like Igbo and you act like Igbo. And it's just, you find that connection, and then you get hungry for the understanding of the middle patches of which your folks survived. So thank you so much for this rich information. And I'm sure there's at least one or two questions I hope we can take from the group in Lincolnville.
We will, and thank you for that. So I'm going to turn it over. You've got it, Mr. Bailey?
I've got it.
Hello, my name is Sandra, and I am concerned, well, not even concerned, and most of my ancestors are deceased. And we didn't do the oral tradition, very few family reunions, so we don't have that. On my father's side, I know just my grandmother's name. And on my mom's side, I only have one uncle, and he will turn 91 in May. So where do I start?
Who wants to take that?
I will. Start with yourself and just start writing down whatever you know. That's a start. Your uncle, if he can speak, someone needs to take an iPhone. I'm sorry, I'm partial to iPhones. Get a video recording of him as soon as possible, as last year. That's how quick. Now, sometimes people will say, well, the elderly, they may forget things. Let me offer this to you. My former father-in-law, before he passed, would always speak highly of his parents, but he would say, and he had Alzheimer's, he said, Mama's people were not regular Negroes like Papa's people. Papa's people were like Africans and enslaved. What he was telling me his mother's people were free persons of color all the way back to the colonial period. So no matter what little they tell you, it is a hint. So you have to start as of yesterday, figure out how you can do this. Also, if your uncle is willing and other family members, DNA has opened up so many doors. So keep in mind, is this uncle your paternal uncle or maternal uncle?
Maternal.
So he carries the Y DNA of his father, his grandfather, and on back. So don't be afraid, like Dr. Seal said, don't be afraid of the DNA technology. It can open up many doors for you.
And also a little side comment, it will be emotional. So doing this type of research, you're going up and down, and you just can't imagine some of the conversations me and this computer have going through some of these records and reading these letters or these cases. There is going to be violence. There's going to be happy days. You're going to see births. You're going to see marriages, and you're going to see deaths. Just know it's all coming. And coming back to Dr. Seal, we are here because they went through that and whatever else, either being free or enslaved. So in the 50s and 60s, no, we were not talking about slave people in our families. And I'm saying that speaking for myself, that was just not anything that was talked about. And it also had some shame to it that you had an enslaved person. Well, we done busted out of that long, it's over now. We have to tell these stories because someone else is telling the stories for you and your family. So if you don't say and also update and correct, that story goes away. Call out those names. And Whitney or Darius, did you want to add anything for her? Okay, if not, we'll move. Is there another question there from Lincolnville? If not, I'll go to the chat.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we're good to go.
Okay, so I'm going to go to the chat. And if any of you here on the panel have a question, or a response, let me know. Update on the museum. We're hoping it'll open in a few months or whatever. Just stay tuned to the main webpage, iaamuseum.org, to keep in touch with everything. Okay, let me see if I got another question coming up. We talked about, yes, my name is actually Shelley Murphy. I am not Reverend Demet Jenkins, and sorry I didn't change that. Okay, what slave records are available? Does anyone want to respond to that? Besides, we talked about slave schedules, but it doesn't have names. But what other, I'm going to say slave records, and again, how people were recorded was slave, not enslaved. We understand that as researchers, 21st century thinking, we want to identify them as enslaved. That term was not used back there during slave era. So no one is trying to, say anything different. Just know that when we're looking at a record, it's going to be property. It's going to be slave. That word enslave is not coming in. So anyone want to respond to what other slave records are available?
Sometimes the enslaving family, some of them had records, like personal family papers. Excuse me. But I can find my family in personal records of the Pinckney family. They donated the plantation records to the South Carolina Historical Society. And that's in Charleston. But I went there and I can find my ancestors on slave lists. They give their birth dates. The farthest I can trace on that side is to 1756, around there. One of the Pinckney plantation owners, he had a plantation book and he wrote everybody ages in there. when they died, who their children were, and so I was able to do that. And so if you do know who the slave owner is, you can. What's the name of the website, Shelley? Is it Archive Grids?
Well, you got archives.gov
Yeah, archive.gov. I think it's one of those.
and there's enslaved.org. That's another one.
Yeah, but what I was talking about, basically, if you know the name of the slave owning family, see if they have records that's held at archives or historical societies and stuff like that.
National Archives, South Carolina Archives and History. Every state has archives at the state level. Then your local historical societies, yes.
Yeah.
Whitney, do you want to add anything? If not, I'm going to keep going.
No, I think that pretty much covered majority.
Can I say something else?
Sure.
I forgot to mention it. I normally would have been mentioning it, but if you have an ancestor that fought in the Civil War, and they applied for pension, those pension files are some of the best resources that you can get. You can get personal testimony from your ancestor himself or herself. And many of the pension files, people, they mention who they were enslaved by. They mention other siblings. Other people from the plantation may have testified in the pension file. Hey, I knew this person my whole life. We were slaves of the same master. We grew up together and stuff like that. And so if you know or you find out that you have an ancestor that fought in the Civil War and they applied for pension, then you can order their pension files and you can find stuff like that in the pension file.
Awesome. And Dr. Seal, one of the questions is, what is the name of the African-American cemetery in Lincolnville? And this person says, I am from James Island.
Bible Sojourn Cemetery.
Thank you. This is for all of you. Is there a difference, or is there a different strategy if you're researching in the North versus the South, or vice versa? And Lyle, I think we might be the older ones out here to talk about that. So I'll let you answer that one.
Okay, so keep in mind, there are going to be general records across the board because of how the United States of America was formed and how the county structures are within the states. So you're going to have general groups of records, North, South, Midwest, that are going to be pretty consistent. Now, keep in mind, Louisiana, you're still going to be dealing with Napoleonic law, but you still kind of have a similar structure or groupings of records. So those are going to be the same. But then you have to look at North versus South, when slavery was officially abolished in the North. So then you're going to have to start really getting into those geographical records of the North to kind of discern what you need to start looking at. And keep in mind also, going back to the colonial period, there are different groups of registries. So we have already mentioned the baptismal records, but also free persons of color. And it varied from state to state, colony to colony, depending on how far you go back. There were registries of those groups of people. Keep in mind, contextually, every conflict, whether it was Bacon's Rebellion of 1676, where you had Blacks and whites involved in that, there are going to be court cases surrounding that. You have the American Revolution. Some Blacks served with the colonies, some Blacks chose to serve with the crown. You're going to have different records depending on the era, depending on what's going on. But you really, and a term I like to use, you have to camp out, not literally, but or just kind of metaphorically, in that particular location. And as Shelley mentioned, exhaust everything. So if you have 100 rocks to overturn, you need to overturn 100 rocks. If it's 1,000 rocks, and it takes you 5 to 10 years, you have to overturn 1,000 rocks to find that one clue that you need.
And someone asked, what was the parish that you mentioned about that your ancestor came from earlier? In
Okay, so
Louisiana, I think it
in
was.
Louisiana, it's in the North Claiborne Parish, Louisiana. And remember, with Northern Louisiana, geographically and politically to a degree, is going to be different than Southern Louisiana.
Right.
And so Northern Louisiana is going to be influenced more by the politics of Arkansas, Texas. And the geography is going to look more like Arkansas and Texas versus Southern Louisiana. So, you know, there's so many different nuances that you have to pay attention to when you're researching.
Okay, so another question is about researching free people of color. What are there resources for researching free persons of color? So I'll leave that open, or I can respond. So their individuals and their family were not enslaved. So do you want to, Whitney, go ahead, you're shaking your head. You want to share if they're free persons of color, what records would you find them on?
I would look like maybe, because if they're free person of color, to see if they're on any of the census records, because they're not the property, they're in their own living, to see that and kind of look and see. And then also just as you slowly work back, you kind of know like the general area to look more into like the county records to see maybe there was like a court case or whatever, and try to look at court records to see like maybe they were enslaved at one point in time and then somehow they earned their freedom, or there was a court case or things like that like had something against them.
Darius, you want to add anything there, or Lyle?
I would say, Whitney, that was good. I would say with court cases, just to expound, that's very important. I have in my family where one of the ancestors operated the toll to get from one side of the river to the next. A Southerner from Virginia said he wasn't going to pay that N-word any toll. And so there was an altercation and he was arrested, but the court case surrounding that was so interesting. But here's another thing too, and please keep this in mind, because slavery was part of the fabric of American society. There were obstacles that were put in the way where you just couldn't necessarily, what I call willy-nilly, oh, I want to set you free. Georgia, Texas, you had to go before your state legislative body. You had to have a petition in order to set your slaves free. You had to have signatures from your community members that this is what you were going to do. And what would happen, like in the state of Georgia, if that was granted, they would write it as part of Georgia legislation. Be it enacted on this day. Haskell Hicks declared that his slaves were free, and this said slave had so many children. By virtue of the inheritance or status being inherited through the mother, the children are declared to be free. And then that leads us to the next point, freedom papers. Typically, your freedom papers had to be registered at the courthouse in the county where you resided. So there are a lot of different types of nuances that you have to be aware of when you're researching free persons of color.
And I've got one question here where they're asking about someone being identified as a lodger in a census record. It's just simply means somebody that's living there. It is not part of the permanent household. This is the time when you want to go look at those, download that questionnaire from the census.gov site and look how they qualify. It will explain who a lodger is, who a boarder is, and so forth. Okay, so let me move on.
Hey, Shelley, really quickly, if you don't mind. We are going to continue actually our workshop until just for a few more minutes. We're actually going to try to begin doing some of the actual work. And so we just want to say goodbye and sign off and just thank you again for having us participate. And I will see you next week, and hopefully the rest of you all also have an opportunity to log into Zoom into the webinar next week as well.
Thank you.
Dr. Seal, I don't know if you have.
Thank you. We'll keep going and gonna answer a few more questions from the chat.
Awesome.
I'll be in soon, Tendaji. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. I was gonna let them wave and say goodbye before I logged out.
Okay, so here's a comment regarding what's a comment in the chat. Marianne put in 1868 voter registration rolls for South Carolina are on South Carolina Digital Library, and she put the link in there. Many with transcriptions, meaning the description of what's in there, names. Charleston County with transcriptions are on CCPL website under research. Thank you for that, Marianne. Okay, let me scroll down and see what else we have here. Okay, thank you, Joe, Dr. Joe, for putting in the Friedmanville site. Let's see. General questions. There's a person here that says they're researching slave stealing case in North Carolina. Can anyone help me understand how the North Carolina records are organized? You know what, Sally Ann Hobson, I think that's a perfect webinar, is to have someone from that archives to come in and explain. So stay tuned for that. Okay. All right. South Carolina, someone's making comment, had a 1865 state tax census. That means you're going to find names and no locations. Okay, another question. Did men had to be the Civil War? Did the men who were in the Civil War had to register for the voter registration? That was from Cherie. Can you comment on that, Lyle?
Yeah, so with the Second Reconstruction Act of 1867, this was the 15th Amendment was already in process being discussed in the Congress. It hadn't been finalized yet, but it was already being discussed. So Black male suffrage was going to be key as part of one of those Reconstruction era amendments. And so with the Second Reconstruction Act of 1867 passed late March of 1867, all males would be registered to vote. So it was just all males if you were of legal age. Didn't matter if you served in the military or not. Now we know with the 15th Amendment, the sad part about that, it excluded the clause or the word gender. So women were excluded from that process. But to answer your question, hopefully I've answered it. All men were registered to vote.
Got it. And Darius, did you see the question directed to you? Theta at 136. She's just telling you her maternal ancestors are from Charleston, and Adeline Pickney is her grandmother. And
yeah, I've seen that one.
Okay, great. Okay, let's see. I'll take just a couple more. Newspaper offering enslaved for sale. Actually, there's a couple websites on the internet that are specifically just tracking runaway slave ads, and you can Google for that. And again, you're also finding out who is in a county that had or that were slaveholders or someone from the slave trade that are putting advertisement out. So that is something to study for the area. Okay, let's see. Tracing land records in various counties in other states, for example, Mobile, Alabama, to the panel. How helpful are sites like this or visiting courthouses to be helpful in these researches or these searches? Anybody can respond to that. I will. They're all good. Expand yourself wherever the info is at and gather it, but it also has to make sense and be supportive to what you know. Okay.
And don't forget the Black Homesteaders research by Bernice Bennett.
Yes.
Several of us, to include myself and Dr. Shelley and many others, we've contributed stories that's on the National Park Service's website. You can just do a simple Google search, Black Homesteaders. But what we did was go to the Bureau of Land Management website. And we specifically looked for land patents issued as a result of the Homestead Act of 1862.
Excellent. Excellent recommendation. Okay, it looks like I pretty much have gathered as many as I could, and it's about 2:20. I just want to thank you all for coming. Thank you for participating in the panel. And we have one next Saturday at 1 o'clock. You can go to the IAAMmuseum.org. Up in the right-hand corner, there's events, and look for the next upcoming scheduled webinars that we have every Saturday. And then there's one on February 21st at 6:30. I appreciate y'all. Lots of love, and enjoy the rest of your Saturday, because I am going to stop the recording right now. There we go.